start. So we're recording now, and we're going to try and start the meeting, which is absolutely marvelous, I hope. Well, welcome to this afternoon, and as you know, it's called Glacial, William Buckland Glacial Impressions, and we've got three presentations. The first off is myself, and then it will be Tom Sharpe, and then it will be Susan Newell, who will try and give some, maybe I think probably some fresh perspectives on things which some of which might be familiar in terms of William Buckland, others not. So what I'm going to try and do to start with is get myself up, if I can. I'm going to share screen in a minute, and hopefully that should work. Here we go, just a minute. Let's get this. If I now go to, oops, I don't want that, that's wrong. Just a minute. That's it. There we go. Now you should be able to see. I'm just going to try and admit some people. A little bit late. Okay. Okay. Move that across to one side. Yeah, and go back on. Okay. We can make a start, I think. One more to admit. I'm sorry about this, people. Right. Okay. I'm going to make a start. Yeah, I'm going to start with a talk which is called Costume of the Glasses, Just a Groovy Cartoon. And I'm sure you will have come across this at some stage before, this image. And I'm going to try and perhaps raise some questions or point some things to you, things that you might not have thought about it, because you've probably just looked at it and thought, oh, that's interesting. Yes, it's Buckland. We know it's Buckland. So I'm going to try and sort of raise a few things in relation to that. So let me see if we can get this better. Actually, it's this cartoon I'm going to look at, which is actually a cartoon or an engraving, which you can see it's foxed, and it actually came from Sopwith himself. And I came across something which is from Sopwith himself. But if you've never had a close look at this, I'm going to point out one or two things on here. You can see there it's scratched by Thomas Sopwith, and in this case he's put FGS at the bottom, and I'll explain where this came from in a minute. It'll be all part of it. And if you don't know much about Sopwith, I'm not going to go in a great deal about Sopwith, and there are some people who know quite a lot about Sopwith here. But here we go. He was born in Newcastle upon Tyne. Sorry about the spelling error there. Apprenticed as a cabinet maker to his father, having had a bit of a private education. His father was a cabinet maker and builder, but he was very industrious, and in his spare time studied architecture and the use of optical instruments and scientific instruments. So he was quite a prodigious individual. And in his cabinet making work and his architectural work, all the stuff that he did, he developed some considerable drawing skills. He was quite a talented drawer. So much so that in 1822 he produced a plan and a model for a new jail at Newcastle. They didn't do anything with it except give him some money, because they thought it was so good. I think he won £10, or they gave him £10 for the prize. 1824, he was out of his apprentice. His father released him from apprenticeship when he was 21, and he joined Joseph Dickinson at Alston in the Northern Pennines as a mining and land surveyor. And that's really where he began to flourish in terms of geology. Now, the important thing for us, I mean, there's lots to do with Sopwith, and you may well have come across him in terms of his wooden models, and the models particularly that he made of the Forest of Dean, the wooden model of the Forest of Dean. And you can see in the lower picture there, he's got one of his models in his hands. But the important thing for us is that in 1826, he drew plans and sections for the Hudgill Burn lead mine, and Buckland came across that and thought they were extremely good, and decided he needed to make an acquaintance with Sopwith, and on doing so, they became lifelong friends. 1833, this book on Alston Moor, which is a classic book, and he was elected to the Institute of Civil Engineers because he worked as not only as a mining and land engineer surveyor, but he became a civil engineer, in short, as a lot of the practical men of that time did. He was elected Fellow of the Geological Society in 1835, and then in the from the late 1820s to the late 1840s, he joins Buckland on field excursions. So that's a bit of the background about Sopwith. The business about him being considerable drawing skills, you'll appreciate elements of that, and it will also come into one of the later talks. Okay. If you haven't noticed on this drawing, this sketch, go down and have a look at the little coach, and you'll see it says to Alston. Some of you will know that, and of course that's an allusion to his where he worked, but actually it is also where this sketch was produced. And we'll talk about that again in a minute. On the left-hand side there are two drawings, one which is specimen number 1, scratched by a glacier 33,333 years before creation, and another one which is a scratch by a cartwheel on Waterloo Bridge the day before yesterday. So in one sense, it's meant to be humorous, but it's also making a point about one of the arguments of the day. And where did that come from? Well, I think it came from Buckland, who had been to the previous year, 1838, he'd been in the Alps, and he was in the Rosenlai Glacier. And you can see here, this is a specimen which is actually in the Oxford University Natural History Museum, and in the Buckland collection, and they've got surface of a bed glaciers showing scratches. So this is taken from the glacier, but he also collected, as you can see there, scratches there, and you'll look at that. It says labelled by Mrs. Buckland by cartwheel from Rosenlai. So this is actually from the town itself, and you can see the scratches, and they're making comparisons between the two, and how do you tell the difference between the two? And of course, that was one of the interesting and comments certainly made by Murchison and Buckland about the glaciation. Perhaps every cartwheel would show where ice has been, according to the Agassiz theory. I'm going to focus in though on this lower part there, which talks about the rectilinear course of these grooves corresponds with the motions of immense body, the momentum of which does not allow to change its courses upon slight resistances. So I'm going to have a look at that in a minute. Incidentally, on the left, you can see it says prodigious glacial scratches. These scratches on the, and you'll hear what that's about as well in a minute. Well, the reason why I'm going to sort of focus in on some of this, or why it got my interest in part, is because I came across a letter which I managed to acquire, which was from Sopwith himself, to Mrs. Laycock. You can see Mrs. Laycock at the bottom, and Mrs. Laycock, we think, was probably the wife of Joseph Laycock, who owned a mine in County Durham, quite a big, in fact, several mines in County Durham, and apparently they'd met at Ilkley and made their acquaintance. So, and he obviously offered her something here, to send her something, and he sent her this letter, but it does explain something about this cartoon. I have much pleasure in sending you 2 impressions of the etching of Dr. Buckland in his glacial costume. I've only got one. The original drawing was made at Hayden Bridge in Northumberland. The doctor had been on a visit to me in Newcastle, and we were going to Whitfield and on to Cumberland. So in other words, they were actually on the way through Alston, through the Northern Pennines, and on the way to Cumberland. The glacial theory, get it up, and that's the second page. The glacial theory was new when newly imported, and Dr. B had taken it up very earnestly. The parcels of plans were some auctioneers' estate plans on a large scale of property in Scotland, including the parallel roads of Glenroy and the line of supposed glacial movements. The prominent letters PGS signify President of the Geological Society. That helps us date it. And the two specimens with the labels originated in a good anecdote of Dr. B having shown to Agassiz two specimens, one a glacial polish, the other a stone rubbed by a cartwheel drags, and the latter was adopted by Agassiz as being the glacial specimen. At this time, Dr. B was doubtful and rejoiced in error of Agassiz. The quotation at the bottom is from an American geologist who Dr. B and I read for the first time on the day, on the evening of the day this sketch was made. Dr. B gave several hundred copies of this etching to his friends, and Mrs. Buckland always considered it a good representation. The dress is in no way exaggerated, which is quite interesting. I employed an engraver on the face. The rest of the etching was done by myself. Mrs. S gives her best regards to you, and with pleasant recollections, I remain, yet very faithfully yours, Thomas Sopwith. So that's the letter which actually explains it. Several interesting things, but that piece which I was showing at the bottom, which is the rectilinear grooves, of course, is quite interesting in terms of saying it was from an American. And there is actually another reference to that, because if we go to, if we now go and look at something he wrote in what was the forerunner of the proceedings of the Yorkshire Geological Society, he wrote this at a meeting in Sheffield in 1842, having talked about Buckland coming to visit him, having been to the British Association meeting in Glasgow. Observations were made in Northumberland, Cumberland and Westmoreland by Dr. Buckland on his return from Scotland. And during part of that journey, I accompanied him from Newcastle to Whitfield, thence to Alston Moor, and over the Crossfell ridge of the mountains into Cumberland. So we actually know where he is. I thus had opportunity of hearing a graphic description on the phenomena in Scotland, to which I briefly alluded. And when at Alston, I read with Dr. Buckland the report of Professor Locke on the state of Ohio, in which he not only describes grooves and scratches precisely similar to those alluded to, but also gives a relief engraving of a specimen which leaves no doubt of its identity. Professor Locke says, the rectilinear course of these grooves corresponds with the motions of an immense body, the momentum of which does not allow it to change its course on slight resistances. So it's there, and he says finally, it is at once evident that this description is exactly correspondent to the effects of glacial action, and it shows very clearly how strong an evidence is afforded by the mere physical conditions of the grooved and polished stone, for it would be impossible more correctly to describe the action of the glacier as witnessed by Agassiz and recorded. There is much reason to conclude on the rounded and grooved and furrowed rocks of Great Britain as legibly upon the rocks in which Switzerland are in juxtaposition with existing glaciers. So he's trying to make an argument here clearly in favour of what glacial action. Who was John Locke, who had actually provided them, furnished them with this material here? Well, John Locke is actually a very interesting character and is a lecturer in himself, an American, born in New England, but he was a botanist, educator, inventor, a pioneer photographer. He was the first person to publicly do an exhibition of photographs in the United States, and he was an early pioneer of soil conservation. What's interesting, I think, as far as we're concerned, is that in 1836 and 37, he was assistant geologist to the Ohio State Geological Survey, and he surveyed the southeast section. And wrote in that, he wrote a considerable report in that. And in that, he talks about Mr. Light's quarry. And we can find this quote in his work on Mr. Light's quarry. And let me go back again if I can. Go back. Whoops. Trying to go back, but I'm failing. Let's go back one, sorry. Yes. He says it's east side of the Miami, which is the river, and 7 miles above Dayton. So what I did is I went there and tried and ascertain where this quarry was and if it was still there or what we might find out from it. And so drew a line on Google Earth. And indeed, when you do that, you can see at the bottom there you find this quarry. The quarry is still in existence, although it's now not used for quarrying. It's now used for a series of infill and industrial buildings. But it is still there, and it will be interesting to try and find out some more, which I haven't managed to do so as of yet. What Locke goes on to do is he found these grooves absolutely fascinating, and he measured them carefully, and he then produced 7 bits of evidence relating to them, which are actually outlined here to some extent. So because he obviously thought these were significant in terms of these grooves, because they were just so prominent in the surface of this thing. And he said, well, what's making these and how does it actually work? They were ground on a perfect plane, is what he said. Some of the larger grooves were deeper and broader than any movements of the teams and the quarry could have produced, and they were at the same time corroded at the bottom. And then this is the important thing here. Number 7, he starts to speculate and says his 7th reasoning is no mechanical operation to which the quarry had been subjected could have ground down the rough stone to a plane. This flattening of the surface seems to be the most difficult to account for. Have superior strata been removed by some horizontal force which slid them off across this surface? The grooves appear as if they have been formed by icebergs floating over the terrace, which is the highest in the neighborhood, and dragging gravel and boulders frozen to its low surface over the plane of the stone. And then we get our quote: the rectilinear course of these grooves corresponds with the motions of an immense body, the momentum of which does not allow it to change its course upon slight resistances. So we get the context of where this actually came from, and it's quite interesting because it's clearly in here. It's in the context of the drift theory, the iceberg theory. And he goes on a little bit in terms of saying what it is. Now, one of the things that he did say is at the bottom is that he wanted to make sure that nobody would disagree with him, and he was just saying that these things were very straight and plain. So at the bottom, if you look at here, he says, I've used a new engine called a medal ruling engine. I said, I have put this specimen into their excellent engine and suffered it to engrave its own picture and thus stop the mouths of fault finders. And there it is. That's the grooves and this new method that was used for engraving, which would enable it to essentially to engrave a form of picture, and you can get relief on it, or what apparent relief on it. I'm going to hold it there. There is much more to do this, but the question I asked is just a groovy cartoon, and it's quite interesting, I think, because Locke was trying to work out and look at whether this was the result of the alluvial, the action of rivers, and he in his arguments, in his 7 arguments, he rules that out, and then he sort of takes it to saying, well, is it diluvial? And he uses these diluvial grooves. And by that, he was talking about it being a mega flood action. And he makes arguments that the very straightness of it means that it could be neither of those. So he then decides it's drift. It is this iceberg action, and the deposits of iceberg action. What's interesting then is that the 4th one is it's a glacial nappe. It's a glacial ice sheet, and it's the ice sheet well beyond, not icebergs, which is actually taking it there. And that's really what Buckland and Sopwith had taken and put on this cartoon. And it got me thinking about, well, what's the significance of this cartoon? And I think the question which is interesting to ask is to say, is it more than a humorous cartoon? And actually it was. We know it was given away. It was given away to all his colleagues. And was this a sketch, a way of forcing an argument? And he was really trying to, although his mind he was in several minds by this stage. I think he'd sort of been convinced about Agassiz's theory, having just been with Agassiz in Scotland. And he obviously was talking and had convinced Sopwith, and who I'm not quite sure exactly what they did, but it'd be interesting. One of the things I would like to do is to try and look at the Sopwith correspondence and see if there's any more information in there as to what might have happened in relation, certainly to the context of the conversations at that time, and whether it was more than just a humorous cartoon, which is always what it's been regarded as, rather a bit of a caricature, but it was something else. It was actually trying to make an argument. It was more subtle. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Okay. What we are going to do is not take questions now, but we'll try and take questions at the end. We're going to take three. We'll have a panel of three, and you can point questions or discussion points to those. So if I'd ask you to reserve those, I meant to say that at the beginning. If, however, you have questions that you want to record for yourself, you could put them in the chat and I will read them out of the chat. So we'll do it that way when we get everybody muted and unvideoed, so to speak. Well, without further ado, I'm going to ask our second presenter, which is Tom Sharpe. Everybody knows who Tom is, so I don't need to introduce him. He'll either introduce himself or certainly he'll introduce his talk. So Tom, over to you. If you would screen share, please, that would be marvellous. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you. That was great. Good to hear more detail on that famous cartoon. So let me see if we can get this working. So I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see my screen. I can still see Duncan, so he's still here, which is good.
I am.
You can hear me okay? Yeah, good. So as we've heard from Duncan, Thomas Sopwith's cartoon of Buckland in his costume of the Glaciers was drawn at Hayden Bridge in Northumberland in October 1840, while the two men were on their way to Alston, heading for Cumberland in search of evidence for glaciation. And although the engraving was done by Sopwith, he employed a professional engraver to portray Buckland's features. The Alston mining district, as Duncan said, in the North Pennines, was a region with which Sopwith was particularly familiar, having published his account of it in 1833. In early July 1842, Sopwith had once again been in Alston and was writing to Buckland on his way back to Newcastle. And here's Buckland to pay another visit to the region, a northern expedition, as spoken of when we last met. His letter described how, coming down through the upper part of Teesdale on Friday the 8th of July, he had seen enormous mounds of moraines, which, with the admirable development of basaltic rocks in this fine valley, afford much interesting matter for observation. With his letter, he enclosed a topographic map to show the moraines in the vicinity of Middleton and Teesdale, which you can see at the bottom part of your screen there. Well, the basaltic rocks he mentions are, of course, the outcrop of the Permian quartz dolerites of the Winshill, which famously forms the waterfall of high force on the River Tees, about 5 miles upstream from Middleton. And Sopwith was drawing attention to the presence of these resistant rocks for the potential to preserve glacial striae. Part of the sill also outcrops on the low ridge of Moor Rig, about half a mile south of Middleton. Well, later in 1842, Sopwith set Buckland a watercolour entitled Surface of Basalt, Grooved and Furrowed Moor Rigs, Teesdale, which he had done on the 12th of October of that year. This pencil, ink and watercolour sketch shows a low-lying, smooth, rounded, furrowed and striated rock surface surrounded by a low shrubby moorland vegetation. The foreground vegetation is depicted through the use of small dabs of ochres and greens and some zigzagging lines. The background vegetation is a more solid block of colour, while the rock is portrayed through a light grey colour wash, following undulating ink or pencil lines with some elongate spots of colour and parallel horizontal ink lines. Well, almost exactly a year earlier, on Monday, the 11th of October, 1841, Buckland and Sopwith had met up in Chester to begin a very wet week's tour of North Wales. They travelled south to pick up Thomas Telford's London to Holyhead Road, then headed west via Llangollen, Corwen, Pentref and Llanrwst, arriving on Wednesday, the 13th of October. So now they were in North Wales. They continued the next day into the high mountains of Snowdonia via Betws-y-Coed to Capel Curig, and then along the Ogwen Valley to Cymydwell and north down the glacial trough of the Nant Francon to overnight at Bangor. The following day, Friday the 15th, they came south via the Pass of Llanberis and then down Nant Gwynant to the village of Feddgelert, where they spent the night at the Goat Hotel. And then on the 16th, they turned north passing the western side of Snowdon via Reedree and Llynnegader to return to Bangor. And they left Wales the next day on the Holyhead to London coach. There's a really good account of this, this journey, which was published in the PGA in 2012 by Michael Roberts. I would direct you to that if you want to know more about their journey. Well, during the course of their tour, Sopwith noted that many of the rocks of North Wales present a furrowed or undulating surface, the curves of which are alternately concave and convex and several feet in length. And he recorded many examples of rocks which were rounded, grooved and polished and worn into bosses or dome-like shapes. Sopwith made at least 4 drawings of these landscape features, helpfully including Buckland for scale. All of them carry Sopwith's name and are dated the 16th of October 1841, which is the day they returned to Bangor. But the drawings include at least one site visited on the 15th. The Sopwith's diary of this journey was written up 2 months later, so the dates may not be precise. And the engravings, the drawings were probably worked up at a later date as well. Well, one of these, which is Pont Aberglaslyn, shows the bridge over the River Glaslyn, the Avon Glaslyn, looking north into the mountains. And Buckland is a small figure here by the roadside. He wears a check coat and a shoulder cape, his coat finishing mid-calf, and a tall hat. In a second, in the same area, near Pont Aberglaslyn, we see a closer figure of Buckland. He's looking down into what appears to be a striated rock surface. We have a better view of his costume with his check coat and cape and with a high collar and his top hat. He leans on a rolled umbrella with his right hand and he holds a bag, perhaps a hammer in his left. His facial features are indistinct. A third drawing near the middle of Llanberis Upper Lake shows an outcrop near what is perhaps the middle of the southern shore of Llanberis, near the village of Llanberis at the foot of Snowdon. The background mountains are shown only in a simple outline, unlike the more detailed view at Pont Aberglaslyn, but they may represent the undulating ridge that rises up to Snowdon itself. Buckland is placed at the centre, with his face visible, but again indistinct, wearing the same coat and cape and top hat, and with a bag hanging to his left side, it's strapped over his right shoulder, and a rolled umbrella in his right hand, while his left hand points to some feature in the landscape. He's standing amongst these smooth, rounded, undulating rock outcrops marked by prominent parallel striations. In a fourth sketch, Drusicoid, Buckland is a tiny figure, you can see way to the left there, of a rounded rock knoll on the shore of a small lake. Well, in his 1842 paper, Sopwith mentions that he made a drawing of the margin of Llynnegader near Drusicoid, and that it is easy to comprehend that this rounded rock might be ground into this form by the pressure of enormous masses of ice. The view in this sketch is from the east, looking across the lake, Llynnegader, to Drusicoid and its distinctive northern truncated asymmetrical peak, the spur of Egarn. Now, there are 2 mountains in Snowdonia called Egarn, this one and another one here overlooking the glacial cirque of Cwmidwal at the head of the Nant Francon. The Idwal area had been visited by Sopwith and Buckland 2 days earlier. This Egarn has a similar truncated spur, Pinnacle Crag, which separates Cwmidwal from the adjacent coombe of Cwm Cywion, and that in the northern side of which is a rounded hill called Foel Goch. Now, this truncated spur and the shape of the distant hills are not too dissimilar to the asymmetrical shaped peak shown in this watercolour. And it also bears comparison with Egarn on Drusicoid drawn by Sopwith. Now, at the rock step at the head of the Nant Francon, there are plentiful examples of glacially smooth and striated roche moutonnées, and especially at the rock lip of Cwmidwal. Well, this watercolour appears to show a smooth, rounded, furrowed and striated rock surface surrounded by a low, shrubby moorland vegetation. And it's not too dissimilar to this smooth, rounded, furrowed and striated rock surface, which was painted by Thomas Sopwith on moor rigs in Teesdale in 1842. Both have the same style of rendering of the vegetation, with spots of colour and zigzagging lines and a more solid tone for the background vegetation. The rocks too are similarly portrayed. And I hope you'll agree with me that it seems likely that these two pictures are by the same hand. Well, this is the complete watercolour of that top image. Standing on the rock surface is a figure wearing a top hat and dressed in a coat which finishes mid-calf. There's a short jacket over the coat, and a strap of a bag or a satchel crosses the back and goes over the right shoulder, the bag hanging on the left side. And the figure holds a hammer and in the right hand, and the face is looking down and the facial features are indistinct. Well, the voluminous costume of this figure is reminiscent of Buckland in his costume of the Glaciers and of Sopwith's portrayal of Buckland in his sketches of their tour in North Wales. There are differences for sure, not least in the medium. There are some differences in the costume. The upper part is more like a jacket than a cape, and only one layer is shown in a check pattern. But there are similarities in the length of the coat, the top hat, the bag to the left side, the strap over the right shoulder, and the positioning of the figure, which avoids showing any facial detail. Well, this watercolour, which is in Buckland family papers, first came to public attention in 1933 when it was published by Fred North in a paper about William Daniel Conybeare, published in the Transactions of the Cardiff Naturalist Society. North had borrowed the original from Hugh Septimus Gordon, one of Buckland's grandsons, and had it photographed and returned it. It was figured in North's paper as Mary Anning, fossil collector at work. Where this identification comes from is not clear. The image was used again by William Dixon Lang in 1949. He noted that Conybeare, Buckland and Dillybeach were a humorous brotherhood, and any one of them, for all the affection in which they held Mary Anning, might well have caricatured her. Lang fails to mention it in a 1960 paper on portraits of Mary Anning, and its next use seems to be in 1982 when it features in two books about Dorset and Lyme Regis. Both accept North and Lang's identification of the figure as Anning, but attribute the light-hearted and affectionately humorous sketch to Dillybeach. This attribution is most likely to come from John Fowles, who was honorary curator of Lyme Regis Museum at the time. And he later told me that he had a dim memory of seeing it ascribed to Dillybeach and printed somewhere else. It seems likely that John is recalling mention of Dillybeach and publication of the image in Lang's 1949 paper, or possibly the one of Conybeare. Well, the foreground rocks and the mountainous background are difficult to reconcile with the cliff profiles of the Dorset coast, especially in showing a receding mountain landscape with hills behind hills. And the perspective just isn't right when viewed from the beach between Lyme Regis and Charmouth. The undulating rocks don't look like the flat limestone ledges of the Lyme foreshore or the bouldery beach. In explanation, John Fowles suggested that perhaps they represent a mudflow at the foot of Black Ven. Well, since 1982, the watercolour has been reproduced extensively as a picture of Mary Anning in the field, usually but not always attributed to Dillybeach. It's in widespread use on web pages about Mary Anning. It was also used for a time as the logo of Lyme Regis Museum, as you see on this badge and on these mugs. The late Joe Draper, Lyme local historian, suggested that the picture dated from the early 1830s, but again, why she said that just isn't at all clear. The only images we have of Mary Anning are two portraits, an oil painted in 1842 and now in the Natural History Museum, and this posthumous pastel copy done in 1850 and now in the Geological Society. They show Anning in a wide skirted green dress and a cloak, a bonnet tied with a red ribbon. It's unlikely that this is what she wore in the field. This is probably her Sunday best put on for this portrait. Her field equipment, though, is in the picture: her basket, her hammer, and her dog. Well, Roderick Murchison visited Lyme in 1825, and he records meeting Anning in the field with her dog, hammer, and basket. And he left his wife, Charlotte, to be accompanied by Mary with her dog, hammer, and basket in fossil hunting among the ledges on the shore. Some 1892 reminiscences of Lyme Regis recalled that the masculine figure, but always smiling face of Mary Anning was seen with hammer and rush vasculum, followed by her little black and white terrier dog making towards the lias beds. If the watercolour does show Anning in the field, might we not expect to see her trademark basket and her dog? Well, Lang described the figure in the watercolour as a thick man-like figure in clogs or pattens, a stout, short petticoat, a shorter check skirt, a masculine jacket, a satchel, and what looks like a battered top hat. This man-like figure fits with several descriptions we have of Anning being a masculine figure or of masculine expression. Now, I do have to admit that the costume does have some similarities to that of a working woman of the period, as worn by women in the fishing industry of Northeast England or Eastern Scotland, for example. The top hat, a male accoutrement, could, it's been suggested, have served as a hard hat. It is, I think, though, also possible we see that figure as a female because it's been identified as such for the last 90 years. Now, there is another possible explanation for the ambiguous rendering of the costume. And for this suggestion, I'm very grateful to Susan Newell. Bearing in mind that the humorous intent of Costume of the Glaciers, although with perhaps some serious folk flat slant to it as well, as explained by Duncan, is Sopwith again poking fun at his friend, recognising that Buckland's clothing gave him the appearance of a Welsh woman in traditional costume. The top hat resembles the tall hat worn by women of Northwest Wales, which differed from those worn by women in South Wales in having a straighter sides rather than tapering sides. And the checked coat is similar as well to the checked skirts. Now, it might have been a bit clearer and a bit more obvious if Sopwith had used one of the more extreme examples of this style, showing this very happy tea party, probably somewhere in South Wales. Well, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I feel that there's enough evidence to suggest that despite the long-standing identification of this watercolour as a picture of Mary Anning on the foreshore at Lyme Regis, drawn by our friend Henry de la Beach in the 1830s, it is in fact a humorous sketch of William Buckland in the field in North Wales in October 1831, drawn by his friend Thomas Sopwith. I rest my case. Thank you.
Marvellous. Thank you very much indeed, Tom. That's absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure it will generate a lot of interest. And I know you're about to publish shortly on that. So we've had something beforehand, which is absolutely marvellous, I think, really. And I'm sure it will be fascinating. People will be fascinated to read the full account when it's finally in print. Okay, well, without further ado, we'll move on to our third presenter, which is Susan Newell. So if Susan, if you can unmute yourself and unvideo yourself and get yourself sharing screen, that would be absolutely marvellous. Here we go.
Hopefully that's okay. It's full screen, I hope. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And yes, we're looking forward to it. Thank you very much indeed. Teaching glaciation at Oxford.
Lovely. Thank you. So thank you for in asking me to contribute to this session about different aspects of Buckland's work on glacial theory. My presentation will look at what Buckland's teaching collections reveal about how he taught this. And I must just say that due to COVID restrictions, since this talk was first planned, I haven't been able to find as many specimens to show you as I would have wished. But I hope you will agree that there's still enough material of interest here. For those of you not familiar with Buckland's work at Oxford, I will first say a little about his practice as a geologist and a teacher there before moving on to glacial theory. Oops, sorry. He had been at Oxford, an Oxford professor for almost 30 years by the time the field trips with Agassiz and Sopwith took place that we have just been hearing about from Tom and Duncan. And these trips and the resulting discoveries about glaciation in Britain were the last major ones of his career. He started teaching in the original Ashmolean Museum building that you see depicted here on the left, But by the early 1830s, due to the growth of his collections, the university organised an alternative geological museum space for him nearby. From 1832, he taught on the top floor of the building on the right. This had been the home of the university printing company, the Clarendon Press. This well-known print allows us a peek behind the facade of the original Ashmolean building to gain an insight into some fundamental aspects of Buckland's teaching style that remained constant throughout his career. Teaching at Oxford at this stage was largely a textual practice, so Buckland stood out as a lecturer who relied on objects in the broadest sense. The curatorial team at the museum today have been able to identify the majority of those objects depicted here. So Buckland's teaching object might be rocks and minerals, fossils, models or casts, and also not shown here are contemporary specimens that he used in his comparative anatomy and botany to identify fossil species. He also had many illustrations, anything from maps, sections, topographical views, diagrams, and wall charts to images of individual specimens that served as proxies for the real thing, including some specially commissioned drawings. These were the PowerPoint slides of their day, and Buckland would spend time selecting and displaying material according to his subject prior to each lecture. Specimens would have been placed on the large teaching table and graphic material pinned up on boards behind him around the room, just as he saw in the lecture room print. As a geological teaching collection from the early 19th century, Buckland's collection is in fact unique. It's worth underlining something that is implicit here. Collecting specimens in the fields and their deployment, either viewed or handed round in the lecture or meeting room, were fundamental both to Buckland's practice as a geologist, creating new knowledge, and as a teacher. From the time of his earliest serious interest in geology, fieldwork was clearly something he enjoyed, and he put in countless miles on horseback, learning to read the terrain in terms of its geology. So it seems completely in character that once news of Agassiz's new work on glacial theory reached him, Buckland and his wife Mary, still a skilled naturalist in her own right, set off together on a field trip to Switzerland at the first opportunity in 1838. Agassiz's revelation must have shaken the foundations of Buckland's interpretation of recent surface geological features. As the leading figure among English geologists who espoused the concept of diluvialism, Buckland believed that these were the after effects of inundations, although he had, of course, modified his earlier biblical interpretation of this theory. It was still, nevertheless, at the core of his work. It is to Buckland's credit that despite having invested so much of his career in diluvialism, he made the long journey to Switzerland to meet Agassiz and assess the evidence for glacial theory in the field. And he returned, as we know, completely converted. In the tradition of the experimentalists of the late 17th century, and we can see Boyle and Newton here on the left, new scientific geologists such as Buckland took pains to demonstrate the proof of their knowledge claims. And Buckland's authoritative use of objects in teaching and research were an important part of his strategy in achieving this. Geology, we must remember, had never been taught at Oxford prior to Buckland, and as an area where it was difficult to demonstrate the validity of new facts or theories, he was concerned to avoid charges of speculation, a byword for doing bad science. So moving on now to teaching glacial theory, Buckland had already visited the Alps 3 times in his early career before returning there in 1838 with Mary. And he would have collected specimens and illustrations during all these visits. Agassiz's theory, based on the evidence of surface features caused by the advance and recession of glaciers witnessed at the time, was fundamental to identifying those similar formations in Britain formed in the recent geological past. In Buckland's archives, there are many prints of alpine landscapes, as well as diagrams, sections, and maps, all of which he could have used to introduce the subject of glacial theory in his lectures. We know from the only manuscript we have, the one for his November 1840 GS paper on the evidence of glaciation in the Scottish lowlands and northern England, that he opened his lecture on glacial theory by referring to Agassiz and the observable evidence in Switzerland. At present, we can only identify relatively few of the relevant specimens. Thanks to Mary Buckland's curation of the collection and the survival of some of her inscriptions, we see here specimens scratched, polished, and cracked by the ice from Swiss sites, collected by the Bucklands in 1838. There are also several plaster models. This is a record shot on the right of one of the Jura region, unfortunately damaged. It may be by Armand Gressley, a local geologist whom Agassiz allowed to make casts in a workshop at his Neuchâtel museum. By contrast, there is also this spectacular model that is still on show today at Oxford. Buckland himself ordered models, we know, when he first visited Switzerland in 1816 with Greenough and Conybeare. There is intriguing reference to a letter to Lady Mary Cole, where he states he had just received 4 large Swiss models from Geneva. And as we saw in the lecture room print, Buckland models were an important means of bringing distant geological formations literally into view for teaching purposes. In perfect time for his British tour, Agassiz published his studies of glaciers in 1840 with lithographs by Joseph Bertenier. Each view of a glaciated landscape came with its own keyed diagrammatic version, and it's been possible for me to match a number of Buckland's enlarged teaching diagrams to this source. Thanks to the report of a lecture given by Sopwith on glaciation, referred to by Duncan before, we know how important this publication was. Sopwith praised, quote, "this splendid work of Agassiz, and especially the admirable plates which accompany it, which afford a clear idea of the principal features of Swiss glaciers." There are other teaching illustrations that relate to Agassiz's plates, like the one on the right here, and other more crude diagrams like the one on the left that nonetheless would have been an effective additional means to show the movement and merging of moraines. Another interesting aspect of Buckland's teaching was his use of everyday objects. Here we have a pair of bone ice skates, and as the old label states, the upper one retains the scratches made in shaping it. The lower one, more used, has lost these and acquired a fresh, polished and striated surface from friction with gritty particles in the ice, end quote. These are items that would have been passed around among his students, allowing them to experience the difference in the shape and texture of each skate through touch. The majority of the illustrations relating to British glaciation derive from Buckland's Welsh trip with Sopwith in late 1841. By this time, Buckland had been intensely criticised for his adoption of glacial theory, not only in more or less friendly banter at the GS, but in print. His trip to Wales only strengthened his conviction, though, and the associated material in his teaching collection assumes an added importance in this light. Sopwith reported that when Buckland presented his findings to the GS in December 1841, he, quote, "gave detail of the several places in which the rocks presented features indicative of glacial action, and which he represented in a large map of the valleys of Snowdonia. They are especially conspicuous and abundant in the valley of Llanberis near Pont Aberglaslyn and Drysy-Coed," end quote. And I believe this is that very map, now conserved in sections. You can see it. It was actually extremely thorough, with the paths of the glaciers marked in green, glacial stretches, mounds and gravel in red, and rounded bosses in black. If the relief features of the topography on Buckland's map appear accurate, that's not surprising, as he was fortunate in being able to buy the latest Ordnance Survey 1-inch to the mile maps for the region that survive in his collection today. The most important was probably this one for his purposes, published only a few weeks prior to his lecture in late September 1841. And I'm grateful to John Henry for helping finding out more about these maps in the literature. There are other drawings showing topographical views of glacial features, such as this one, enlarged from one of Sopwith's prints. In a different, more diagrammatic style, we have the one on the right of the Falls of Ogwen, showing the polished and distinctive shaping caused by the driving movement of the ice, referred to by Buckland as rounded bosses, marmorated rocks, or by the French term used by Agassiz, roche moutonnées. I'm grateful to a descendant of Buckland's for sight of this marvellous letter. Just before his Welsh lecture at the GS, Sopwith wrote here excitedly to Buckland, telling him about new evidence of glaciation that he had witnessed being uncovered in a quarry in the Tyne Valley, including 2 sketches to explain the exact nature and scale of the evidence. Buckland quickly had enlarged versions of these sketches made and took them with him to London, where 9 days after receiving the letter, he added it to the end of his lecture to the GS on glaciation in Snowdonia. I think Sopwith's letter is worth quoting. He says, "Today the workmen were bearing the upper surface of a bed of limestone, the only cover of which was a stiff clay mixed with rough angular fragments of stone 10, 15 and 20 inches long. A considerable portion of the surface of the limestone was laid bare, as shown in the annex sketch. And the plan of this exposed surface was thus." This is the enlarged version you see here. "The whole of this surface, which is nearly level, is gloriously polished and grooved and scratched in a most decided and persuasive manner, so that even fragments which I have brought here carry conviction with them." So here we have Sopwith, very much Buckland's disciple in the matter of glaciation, forcefully expressing the necessity of procuring and using specimens and illustrations as visual rhetoric to, quote, "carry conviction." Well, as we know, Buckland's efforts to convince those people in the ascendant in the GS at this time about glacial theory did not, in fact, succeed. I hope I have convinced you, though, that his collections bear witness to him having given it his best shot. So thank you very much.
Marvellous. Thank you very much, Susan. That's absolutely fascinating and interesting. And I think all 3 of these talks have really shown perhaps an almost pivotal role that Sopwith played in supporting Buckland in relation to his glacial theory. He obviously became totally convinced, I think, as we've all demonstrated one way or the other. Okay, well, without further ado, I think what we should do is we'll try and throw it open for 5, and maybe if we go over our 2 o'clock deadline, maybe 10 minutes or whatever else. If you have questions, you can either put them in the chat, and I'll try and pose those to either myself, Tom, or Susan. Or if you would like to raise your hand on the reactions and your reactions down at the bottom of your thing, if you click that, you should find where it says raise hand, and I will try and find out where you raise hand. Okay, we've got some questions coming in already. So it's this to you, Susan, really. Said Cynthia Burrocks has asked, who did Buckland's drawings for his teaching?
Yes, thank you for that. By this date, Buckland employed a local Oxford artist, a man called Joseph Fisher, and I think you saw in the caption to one of my the enlarged view of moraines in North Wales, the Glyn Gladder one, I think. There is an inscription which says copied from Sopwith by J. Fisher. And from the time of really the Bridgewater Treaties material, Fisher was very active working for Buckland in the background. I mean, that's not to say that Mary Buckland didn't also do things, but I think much less so by this period. And it is quite difficult because she doesn't tend to sign anything after her marriage, apart from the things, of course, that were published, for example, in relation to the landslip. some of those drawings were used in teaching, and they are signed by her, but that's rare in the later period. But before marriage, she certainly did quite a few things, and yeah, I hope to write something with Peter Lincoln on that at some point. So thank you.
Any more questions, or anybody want to say something? You can undo your video and unmute if you wish. I'm just looking to see if there are any hands raised. Which I can't see.
Just
Phil James.
Yeah, just one quickly for Tom. Absolutely fascinating, the so-called Mary Anning watercolour, which I've done a talk on Mary Anning, and of course that's in there. So I'm quickly going to go in and change that. I think it's quite startling what you found, and absolutely spot on. So you're going to publish, would that be in the form of a paper, or how will that come out?
Yeah, it's been accepted for Earth Sciences History, and it's going to be in the first issue for this year. So next month it should be out.
Right. Is that something that would be available freely, or you don't know?
I don't know. I've still got to pay my subscription and get a copy myself. So
Yeah.
I don't know what the arrangements are for that.
No. Okay.
You could always join History of Earth Sciences Society, which would give you access to all their archive of their journal. I know.
It's on my list of things to do today.
The History of Earth Sciences Society.
Indeed, it's our American sister organisation.
Right.
They do publish a journal,
Yeah.
and you know it'll be published in there. It
Thank
is.
you.
There will also be a summary in the next issue of the HOGG newsletter, the new revised revamped HOGG newsletter.
Good. Yeah. Well, I look forward to reading it in there then. Fantastic.
Okay, once I get around to writing it. Yeah.
Two other questions, if I may. Martin Evans says, was Buckland's attention ever drawn to the parallel roads of Glenroy? Two things. I mean, the letter which I have says that actually the under his arm in that picture, it says maps of I'm just looking at it now. Maps of ancient glaciers, and he's got a parcel under his arm, and that's actually of the estate of Glenroy. So that was actually what was under his arm at that time. So the answer is yes, he'd been to Glenroy earlier on his trip, just before that cartoon costume of the glaciers was, the sketch etching was drawn. And that was what was under his arm. So if you wonder what it says, maps of ancient glaciers, and you wonder what's in there, they are plans of the Glenroy estate, on which he had already marked on evidences of glaciation, as he and Agassiz had drawn up. And that was subsequently used in various arguments that were about the origins of Glenroy, famously, of course, with Darwin. Okay, the second one is from Roderick Gordon. Welcome, Roderick. Roderick Gordon is a direct descendant of William Buckland. And your question is, am I right in thinking that the early animosity between Darwin and Buckland originated in their differing theories concerning the glacial? And I'll let Susan answer that, because I've just alluded in part to that. So, but I'll let you answer that one, Susan. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, other people might have different evidence that they can bring forward here, but to my mind, I'm not sure it is right to say that it's really animosity between them. I personally wouldn't have thought that. I mean, there's a wonderful letter on the Harvard website where all Agassiz's correspondence is available, where Buckland writes to Agassiz with a transcription of a letter that Darwin has sent to Fitton, that Mary writes out again. And it's basically Darwin in about 1843, I think. So after all of this is in the air very much, saying how he'd been to North Wales and how he completely agreed with a lot of the evidence that he'd seen. And Buckland actually, I'm not sure that Buckland sort of maybe took the letter partially, I'm not sure, but obviously Buckland didn't always agree. with Darwin didn't agree with every aspect of Agassiz's glacial theory, but the letter shows that they were actually, you know, not at all in disagreement, certainly at that point. I don't know whether anyone else would like to add anything.
I mean, there have been things written on this, and in fact, Darwin did recognise that the evidence was overwhelming, and it was actually to his embarrassment that he'd misunderstood and misinterpreted what was going on at Glenroy, and it was one of the things. Some people have suggested it's one of the things that made him contributed to his reclusiveness and withdrawal from public geological discussions. There are others who are less convinced by that, but as I say, there are interesting arguments about Darwin and his theories of glaciation, and of course there was a very famous or an interesting one in related to when he was in North Wales and Comidwell, and he changed his mind on Comidwell, as you just said. Did I see a hand there from Jill Durrell, was it?
Yeah, it's Brian Rosen here, also a member. But,
hello.
I'm sharing Jill's computer. I've been very interested in Darwin in North Wales, and I know that he revisited it with Sedgwick, which of course he visited Comidwell the first time, of course, with Sedgwick. Or I don't know whether it actually was with him, but he was on that famous trip with Sedgwick. They joined and rejoined each other. And then he says in that, when he reports on his later visit, that he was astonished that he hadn't recognized the signs of glaciation in Comidwell. And then he gets off on these big boulders, which are on the left, as it were, when you look into Comidwell. And he seems to be very preoccupied with theories about boulders that have dropped through the ice rather than boulders that have been dragged along by the ice. So there were other people, I think even Alfred Russel Wallace got involved in those arguments a bit later too, about the origin of large glacial boulders, free boulders, not roche-moutonnées. So he writes about that too. And the boulders are quite special and spectacular. And you can go and visit them, of course, when you're in Comidwell, which is quite nice to follow in Darwin's footsteps there. But certainly he just expresses astonishment at himself for not recognizing the signs of glaciation. So he would appear to have been in agreement with Agassiz and Buckland. Thanks.
Indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that. Yes. Are there any more points anybody would like to raise, or questions or discussion? Brian.
Yeah, I do have a little apostrophe on that, which is that he also goes to Moel Triven, the area we know very well, not Triven, but Moel Triven, yes, and above Nantclere, more or less. And there he found the shells, yes, which to him represented changes of sea level or movement of ice, from bringing up shelly material. I've revisited that site and not succeeded in finding the shells, but I will go back and have another go at that. Thank you.
And it is a useful point to clarify, because a lot of people do misinterpret that as being Triven because it's close to Comidwell.
Absolutely, but it's round the other side.
Yes, of course, it's over the hill and round the other side, and down in the valley, so to speak, towards Carnarvon.
It's up on quite a prominence. But the other thing is that someone's put a nice plaque to Darwin on Moel Triven on the top, and there's an outcrop of Ordovician conglomerate, the Kilgwyn conglomerate there. And it talks about that too, but it's not to do with the glaciation, so I won't sidetrack on that.
That was, of course, Moel Triven was one of the key evidence arguments that, with Murchison, as to why the drift theory really should be enforced rather than the glacial theory in North Wales. He used that with what he thought was great effect, at least. And he was never convinced by Agassiz's theory.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, well, we've gone 5 minutes over, but that's not bad, I think, for 3 talks, which we've packed in quite a lot of information, I think, and hopefully you've enjoyed it and it's stimulated a little bit of discussion and thinking. And 2 things. I see Irina Clear is here. Hello. And I think you're current president of the History of Earth Sciences Society, and she puts a point that the membership is relatively low in terms of, I presume that you mean in terms of subscriptions, and I think it's about $60 for, and you get for that both the print and the digital archive all the way back. So it's just in terms of that. And the second thing I'm going to say is just to say thank you very much to everybody, and that we do have our next major meeting will be the, it's actually called, it's the meeting that was postponed last year due to COVID, which was to celebrate the, mark the bicentenary of Greenhoff's 1820 map, or the Geological Society's map. And so we've revived that, and it will take place on a day, and it will be online again. And it's called the Geological Society's Map, Understanding George Belus Greenhoff and his 1820 Geological Map. And I'm pleased to say that all the previous speakers from last year have reconfirmed that they can present this year. Presentations will be slightly shorter than I think face-to-face or in person. And of course, it won't be, in one sense, it won't be quite convivial. It will be an all-day event, but there will be regular breaks, because I know that screen time can be quite demanding. So we're going to do it in lots of 2. And that's on the Wednesday, the 12th of May. You will get an invite as a HOGG member. You'll get an invite to that. And again, it will be through Eventbrite that you will need to book your ticket for that event. So all being well, we'll see you there. And thank you very much indeed for coming. Okay.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to end now, so I shall say cheerio and everything else. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.